Hello, my name is Genevieve Maurik, and I like to call myself an inspired writer and an inspirational fiction reader who reads, writes, and lives for Jesus, but especially a big fan of something called biblical fiction. If you're new here and don't know a lot about biblical fiction, then be sure to stick around till the end of this video for literally tons upon tons of new book recommendations that I have for you. And even if you're a seasoned biblical fiction buff, the same could also be true. You might find something new to enjoy and discover as well. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the history of the subgenre of Christian fiction, biblical fiction. Specifically, what it is, where it came from, and what the genre looks like today. I will also be featuring the 10th anniversary edition of Pearl in the Sand by Tessa Afshar, and I am so excited to show that to you more in detail later on in this video. I was kindly given a copy of this new edition by the publisher, but as usual, little disclaimer, all thoughts and opinions are always my own. Christian literature has existed for years, decades, centuries even, as far back as when it was widely considered that fiction was not worth reading if it did not have a scriptural message to it, or some kind of Christian subtext. Think of your favorite works of classic fiction. Even if the plot didn't revolve around something scriptural or religious specifically, it usually featured religious characters or Judeo-Christian values of some kind, or there was some kind of message that usually had something to do with traditional church values. Even if the main plot didn't revolve around a salvation arc, the characters were usually Christians or they practiced religion in some way. The protagonists were considered morally good, while the villains were considered morally bad. Stories were often used to teach specific values like parables, and as such, many stories were used to teach about patterns of behavior that at the time society deemed upright. Christian fiction is now its own bona fide literary category, with subcategories like contemporary fiction, historical fiction, speculative fiction, and loads more, but namely, for the sake of today's video, obviously, biblical fiction. Biblical fiction is an increasingly popular subgenre that focuses on a specific time period of history. It is not to be confused with historical fiction because it takes place specifically during the time in which the Bible was written, or in that general era, depending on how you yourself categorize it. It's a genre that is defined by its biblical setting. It usually has something to do with biblical figures like Moses or Abraham or Isaac, or even figures from the New Testament, but it may also include fictional characters experiencing real historical biblical events. For the purposes of this video, please allow me to briefly define what I mean when I say biblical fiction going forward. These are the parameters that I personally use to decide what is and isn't biblical fiction, and where I put biblical fiction books or historical fiction books on my own personal bookshelves. Some of you may have different ideals or views on what does and does not qualify as biblical fiction, and that's a-okay, but when you hear me refer to biblical fiction in this video, just know that this is specifically what I mean about biblical fiction. Biblical fiction is 1. A subgenre of Christian fiction and Christian historical fiction. 2. It is distinguished from historical fiction, which is a broad, overarching category, because it is specifically set during the time in which the Bible was written, from Genesis all the way through to the New Testament era. 3. Biblical fiction is sometimes told from the fictionalized perspective of a real biblical figure, or sometimes told through the perspective of completely fictional characters experiencing real historical biblical events. Biblical fiction, because it is a subgenre of Christian fiction, must have some kind of evangelical intent, meant to teach something about the Bible or God. Secular fiction set during ancient times would not qualify as biblical fiction because it does not have a faith-related message. I'm going to be mentioning and referencing a lot of different books and resources throughout the rest of this video, and to the best of my ability, I will try to credit those and link those in the description box below. But if you have any more questions or clarifying questions, be sure to leave those in the comments as well. Biblical fiction can easily be defined as any book that takes place during a biblical setting. This can be as broad as a story that occurs around or based off of a biblical event, such as Connie Lynn Cassette's 2016 release, Out from Egypt, which focuses on fictional characters experiencing the Exodus, or as narrow as a story that reimagines a biblical figure's life, such as the aptly titled Sarai by Jill Eileen Smith, published in 2012. Prior to the 21st century, these kinds of tales represented a very niche genre of biblical fiction, Charlton Heston films, and Cecil B. DeMille epics. Aside from Lew Wallace's 1880 novel Ben-Hur and its subsequent film adaptations, many people just a few decades ago would have been hard-pressed to come up with other examples of this genre. In 1942, Douglas's The Robe renewed cultural interest in tales from millennia ago, but these two works were hardly enough to constitute an entire genre. There may have been, and certainly were, other books that could be classified as biblical fiction from these periods long ago, but these are the two most well-known examples. When studying what has made biblical fiction rise so much in popularity in the past 20 to 30 years, it's important to also note Francine Rivers. Most people know Francine Rivers as the author of Redeeming Love, a biblical adaptation of Gomer and Hosea's story set during the 1800s in California. I do not classify Redeeming Love as biblical fiction, but rather as biblical allegory, since Redeeming Love is not trying to be an interpretation of the Bible story set in Bible times, but is rather a parable set in an entirely different universe with more creative license taken to it to tell a story, rather than accurately represent biblical culture. In the 1990s, Francine Rivers began to rise in popularity within the evangelical fiction and Christian fiction community. Francine Rivers' Mark of the Lion series was published in 1993, 1994, and 1995, respectively. The Mark of the Lion series is set during the days of the early church under Roman persecution, and definitely paved the way for more ancient historical novels. But do we consider the Mark of the Lion series as biblical fiction? That depends on your definition of what it means for a novel to be set during biblical times. For my own personal ease, I do shelve it with biblical fiction, but it is one of those novels that falls into a gray area in terms of, is this biblical fiction because of its setting? Still, the idea of ancient historical fiction and early biblical fiction remained somewhat of a niche category. This changed in the year 1997 when Anita Diamant's novel of feminism and self-discovery, The Red Tent, was published. According to Eileen Cooper, trends are always easier to explain in retrospect than to predict in advance. So it is with the recent onslaught of biblical women in mainstream fiction. Yes, biblical stories have been turning up on bestseller lists since at least Ben-Hur and The Robe, and of course they remain staples in the world of evangelical fiction, but at least since the runaway success of Anita Diamant's The Red Tent in 1997, there has been another run on the biblical bank. Yes, biblical scholars are likely to dismiss these feminist interpretations as woefully speculative, but don't tell that to the millions of satisfied The Red Tent readers. Diamant's fictional reimagining of Old Testament women was recognized as a sensation, garnering readers from a wide variety of demographics, religious and non-religious included. Despite these and more markers of success, the book and the author herself were not without criticism from biblical scholars, who saw the finished work as a crude and borderline blasphemous novel that spread harmful stereotypes about the Jewish and Christian religions. The Red Tent's massive financial success, however, could not be ignored. Traditional mainstream and Christian fiction publishers soon took notice, and a genre was born: biblical fiction. The Red Tent incited a polarizing literary movement amongst writers, Christian and non-Christian alike. Since then, the genre has exploded, but critics have continued to wonder why. I would propose that the answer, at least in the Christian fiction market, is simple. In a response to the continuous publishing of in-your-face, graphic, darker, and more explicit novels in mainstream media, these new stories forego sexual experiences in favor of spiritual experiences. And this is true across the Christian market. But biblical fiction specifically brings the Bible and the Word of God to life in ways that many readers have never before experienced. It's a form of faith-filled inspiration that readers can't get enough of. Many use these works to supplement their own Bible study or as a way to encourage themselves when they're just looking for positive entertainment. The Red Tent changed the publishing landscape completely, both for mainstream and evangelical fiction publishers. In the past 20 years, there has been an onslaught of biblical fiction that has, according to Eileen Cooper in 2004, rescued women from the paternalistic milieu of Scripture and given new life in a quasi-feminist context. After Diamant opened the flaps of her tent, more and more women of the Bible keep finding new and self-assertive lives in the pages of historical fiction. But Diamant's book was not an instant success. Anita Diamant did something that not many authors have been bold enough to do before. She took sacred characters and figures from dominating world religions and crafted a story around them to promote a specific message. According to Rosen, the book was met with lackluster sales upon its initial release, and the publisher considered pulling the book at the time. But rather than doing that, Diamant suggested to her publisher that they mail out copies of the book to Reform rabbis, accompanied by cover notes as a marketing tactic to appeal to Jewish readers. Rosen goes on to explain that this scheme worked well because these mailings paid off many times over with increased sales, and the book now reaches readers well beyond the Jewish community. What Diamant tapped into was not merely writing a book with social justice undertones. That had been done many times before. Diamant saw an opportunity to appeal to women and to help them see themselves in the biblical narrative. Biblical women are intriguing characters for a variety of reasons, not the least of which are the miraculous and larger-than-life tales to which they have lent their names. According to Sass, in 2014, what makes these women particular interesting characters for historical fiction is that their personal lives are not very well fleshed out in the Bible, and that leaves a lot of room for a novel to take off. In other words, in the 21st century, many have found that female readers are more interested in Esther and Tirzah than Judah, Ben-Hur, and Messala. While avid readers gushed over the Red Tent, religious leaders could not get them to stop despite their criticism of the novel as a sacrilegious attack on Judeo-Christian values. One writer in particular, Simone Latvan-Sofian, argued that the Red Tent was a disturbing attempt at creating something she likened to quote-unquote modern midrash for Jewish and Christian women, taking away all the best parts of the biblical narrative. Rather than filling the book with a message about spiritual discovery, Diamant chose to fill the book with a message of self-discovery, almost removing God from the equation altogether. This, according to Sofian, was the book's downfall. Diamant had stated firmly in the past, "The Red Tent is not a translation, but a work of fiction." By giving Dina a voice and by providing texture and content to the sketchy biblical descriptions, my book is a radical departure from the historical text. And also that, I did not study the Bible or rabbinic sources. In her own words, she maintains her position as a fiction writer, saying, "I had no intention of becoming a biblical scholar, but I needed material about daily life, especially the daily life of women." However, Sofian says that it's the implications of Diamant's writing, intentional or not, that made the book a dangerous middle ground. Most rabbinic scholars dismissed The Red Tent as an insignificant historical fiction novel suited only to women's book clubs and the like. They did not take it seriously, nor were they concerned that it would have lasting effects on society. Sofian, a rabbi's wife and scholar in her own right, believed that this was the wrong choice. According to Sofian, the tradition of retelling and recasting traditional narratives, especially by women, about biblical women, is an accepted element in modern Jewish scholarship, meaning that it is a common occurrence in the world of literature. However, The Red Tent does not simply recast a traditional narrative. In many places, the narrative is changed altogether. Sofian explains in her own words, Rebecca is portrayed as the Oracle of Mamre, where she perpetuates the worship of her traditional goddesses, thus denying any connection between the matriarch with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's God. In her world, the women's religion died with Leah and Rachel. All we have is a vengeful monotheism. In other words, Diamant's interpretation, while boasting that it puts women back in the Judeo-Christian religious narrative, does not do so at all. It continues to separate women from the Judeo-Christian religion and vilifies sacred biblical figures. Sofian argues that this is not just a wrong done against the biblical patriarchs, it's also a wrong done against the biblical women themselves. Before I go any further, I think it's important to mention that this video is not an attack on Anita Diamant, nor is it an attack on The Red Tent or anyone who has enjoyed The Red Tent in the past. Rather, this is merely a critical look at the history of the book and its impact and its influences on the genre, both positive and negative, to better situate it within the history of biblical fiction as a whole. It remains that the book was and is still a driving influence on readers. Many fans of biblical fiction have stated that Anita Diamant's The Red Tent was a driving influence on their discovery of the genre, while others maintain that Anita Diamant's The Red Tent is a book to be avoided at all costs. Regardless, the subject of the book continues to be polarizing amongst readers, so in the comments and responses to this video, let's remember to stay kind, uplifting, and positive to each other. Regardless of your opinions on the book, good or negative, it's important to study the book and its impacts on the genre of biblical fiction as we know it today, because it was so successful, and because it was so talked about. Sofian states that Diamant's modern midrash fiction, rather than showing how Sarah was the only matriarch to speak to God directly, instead shows the suppression of the women's devotion to their pantheon of gods. While this is potentially a brilliant choice artistically speaking, many hold that it has dire consequences for the perception of Jewish and Christian followers in the modern day. Some have argued that the book perpetuates the idea surrounding Jewish and Christian religions that all followers of these doctrines are violent, misogynistic, and intolerable. Sophian refers to this as the foundation myth and writes that its portrayal in the Red Tent shows that male encounters with the divine allow men an excuse for what should be inexcusable behavior. This portrayal, according to Sophian, is dangerous for all Jewish and Christian people, but in particular female believers. Sophian writes that Diamant's book leads women to question the truth of this monotheistic Judaism for themselves. Rather than searching for a fuller Judaism, which incorporates the female in God as well as the female Jew's relationship with God, we are faced with Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, who worship Inanna, Asherah, Anat, and Ilat. Because the book causes women to question their faith, Sophian believes that scholars should not ignore it because faith and religion are important and highly sacred parts of life. Sophian closes her article with a passionate demand for better biblical fiction and better representation of Jewish history, writing, "Simply evoking Jewish terms or biblical characters does not make a text Jewish. At a time when many Jews are seeking spiritual identity, it is essential that the community be careful about what it embraces. What is its meaning and its message, and therefore what is its effect? The Red Tent cannot be ignored as just a very popular but inconsequential work of fiction." Sophian was right about one thing: the Red Tent was anything but inconsequential. Would I consider the Red Tent as biblical fiction according to my personal definition? Probably not, because it lacks explicitly evangelical intent. But it is a part of a larger category and a defining influence on the genre since its publication. The Red Tent may not have created biblical fiction, but its controversial portrayal of biblical figures shone a light on a pressing need, exposing the demand for good storytelling in the religious fiction community and beyond. Because of the Red Tent's success, mainly because of its polarizing nature, lovers of historical fiction can enjoy an ever-growing number of books that reimagine the lives of biblical characters. In many cases, these novels, like Diamant's, give voices to lesser-known and often female individuals, according to Dreyfus. Religious fiction and stories inspired by religious figures or values have become increasingly popular, and that is in large part due to the Red Tent. Diamant's style of narrative and compelling storytelling challenged the previous limitations of the genre. A large part of religious fiction's recent revival and subsequent success has been due to readers' desires to be transported to another world, an inspirational world with characters that they can actually relate to. Alex Perez, a doctor of education, writes for Library Journal that authors like Diamant, who write for the masses, and authors who write more explicitly religious fiction are driving change by including relevant, inspirational literature that speaks directly to the spiritual needs of their readers. Relevance is the key here. These new biblical novels adapt the narratives to speak to current social issues. These books are like sermons, taking biblical facts and sharing them in a way that incites a movement within a congregation. In this case, the congregation is a market full of hungry consumers, anxiously awaiting the next book that they can devour. Since the Red Tent, there has been a string of successful biblical fiction novels that all borrow elements from Diamant's formula, such as strong female characters and female-centric stories. But these books put these elements into an inspirational setting. If you'll recall, earlier this year, I invited biblical fiction author Misu Andrews to come and participate in an interview on my channel. I will try to link that video and others in the description box below, but in that video, she also acknowledged the effects of the Red Tent on her own career as a religious historical fiction novelist.
So I went to Sandy Cove in 2001, and I talked with an agent and two editors. The first editor I talked with said, "Oh, you really need to stick with speaking because you're never going to be a writer." Oh, yeah, it was awful. And he said, "Well, have you ever read biblical fiction?" And I said, "No, not really." He said, "Well, you probably ought to start, and you should start with Anita Diamant's The Red Tent." It had only just come out not long before that, and I'm not recommending this as Christian fiction, but it's very good historical Jewish fiction. So I read this, a little shocking in some parts, like I said, not Christian fiction, but then I read Lynn Austin's Gods and Kings. Incredibly good Christian biblical fiction. And then my next was Francine Rivers' Mark of the Lion series, and I just have that on digital, so I don't have that in paperback to show you, but Oh, I loved it. So those two women I owe my publishing career to. They are just amazing.
It is here in the late 1990s and early 2000s that we really start to see how religious and Christian publishers decided to respond to the red tent phenomenon. Modern biblical fiction published under the evangelical banner highly values research and accurate representation of the history and the culture surrounding the time of the Bible and the individuals who lived through it. A landmark book from this era would be Bad Girls of the Bible by Liz Curtis Higgs, which combined Bible study with fictional writing to both tell a story and teach a lesson. But biblical fiction was still a pretty hard sell to most traditional publishers. In an interview with Anne Bile in 2018, Misu Andrews said, "I used to read Bible storybooks to my kids. Then, when they'd gone to bed, I'd get out my Bible and read about the people in the stories. As I read, I wanted to know what kinds of trees were there, whether it was hot or cold, what the air smelled like. My goal in writing is having readers smell and taste that history." She goes on to say, readers are interested in seeing characters in the Bible become real people. The Bible was written in a patriarchal society, so when a woman is recorded in a story, either by name or role or position, she must have been important enough to include. I want to know as much as I can about each of those barely mentioned women as possible, and then imagine the parts we don't know by studying history and culture surrounding them. In 2001, Misu Andrews began submitting her work to publishers, but it took 10 years for her first novel to be traditionally published. It is interesting to note that that book was called Love Amid the Ashes, published in 2011, and inspired by the biblical account of Dinah's story and the patriarchs, which was also the inspiration for the Red Tent. Although the most basic plot points remain the same, such as Dinah's genealogy and some key biblical events, Andrews' novel differs in its tone and it provides a much more inspirational view of faith, God, and redemption. In this novel, Dinah undertakes a journey of forgiveness and ultimately learns that no one is too far from the one true God. Love Amid the Ashes won the ECPA Book of the Year award in 2012 in the debut category, and Misu Andrews has since gone on to become a staple in the biblical fiction genre. The untold stories of the patriarchs' wives and the other women in their lives continued to be a good selling point long after the Red Tent. Was this because readers were looking for more perspectives on the story that Diamant had already told, or was Old Testament fiction just really trendy at the time? Definitive proof of either of these points probably doesn't exist, but it is interesting to look at the patterns present in the publication of biblical fiction novels during the 2000s and early 2010s. Let's take a look at a bibliography of biblical fiction during this time. Keep in mind that this is not an all-inclusive list, just some books by some authors that I know, I have read, or that I personally have on my shelf or consider noteworthy. This list also only includes novels that are traditionally published because it's harder to track the successes of self-published novels, but there has also been a huge influx of self-published biblical fiction novels as well. This is not to invalidate self-published or indie published authors because they are amazing and incredible at what they do, but rather this is just to show market trends in the traditionally published industry. During this time, we saw lots of Old Testament fiction being published, and in particular, a lot of fiction that centered around real historical biblical figures as the main characters, as opposed to fictional characters experiencing biblical events. In 2002, we had A Lineage of Grace by Francine Rivers. 2005 brought us the first 3 books in the Chronicles of the Kings series by Lynn Austin, Gods and Kings, Song of Redemption, and the Strength of His Hand. 2006 brought us Faith of My Fathers and Among the Gods, the last 2 books in the Chronicles of the Kings series by Lynn Austin. In 2008, we saw Francine Rivers' Sons of Encouragement. 2009, we saw Michael by Jill Eileen Smith, the first book in her Wives of King David series. 2010 brought us Abigail by Jill Eileen Smith, the second book in the Wives of King David, and Pearl in the Sand by Tessa Afshar. Bathsheba by Jill Eileen Smith was published in 2011, which was for the Wives of King David, Book 3. And in 2011, as we previously mentioned, we also had the book Love Amid the Ashes published by Misu Andrews. In 2012, we saw Sarai by Jill Eileen Smith, which was a part of her Wives of the Patriarch series, Love's Sacred Song by Misu Andrews, and Harvest of Rubies by Tessa Afshar. 2013 brought us Harvest of Gold by Tessa Afshar, Return to Me by Lynn Austin, Book 1 in the Restoration Chronicles, Rebecca by Jill Eileen Smith, Book 2 in the Wives of the Patriarch series, and Love in a Broken Vessel by Misu Andrews. In 2014, we saw Keepers of the Covenant by Lynn Austin, The Restoration Chronicles, Rachel by Jill Eileen Smith, Book 3 in the Wives of the Patriarch series, In the Field of Grace by Tessa Afshar, a Ruth retelling, In the Shadow of Jezebel by Misu Andrews, and Esther, Royal Beauty by Angela Hunt, the first book in the Dangerous Beauty series. More recently, the amount of authors and books being published in the traditionally published industry under the biblical fiction category has only continued to grow and expand. So obviously I can't include them all, but just by looking at a few brief snapshots, it's still clear to tell that there's been a huge expansion in the writing style, the types of stories offered, and the variations and different takes on biblical events and stories. New Testament era fiction has also grown in popularity, and there has also been a rise in stories about fictional characters experiencing biblical events and lesser-known biblical figures. 2015 brought us The Pharaoh's Daughter by Misu Andrews, On This Foundation, Book 3 in the Restoration Chronicles by Lynn Austin, The Crimson Cord by Jill Eileen Smith, the Daughters of the Promised Land series, and Bathsheba, Reluctant Beauty by Angela Hunt. 2016 brought us Delilah, Treacherous Beauty by Angela Hunt, Counted with the Stars by Connie Lynn Cassette, Land of Silence by Tessa Afshar, Shadow of the Storm by Connie Lynn Cassette, The Prophetess by Jill Eileen Smith, and Miriam by Misu Andrews. In 2017, we got Egypt's Sister by Angela Hunt, Wings of the Wind by Connie Lynn Cassette, Redeeming Grace by Jill Eileen Smith, and Bread of Angels by Tessa Afshar. In 2018, we got even more books like Judah's Wife by Angela Hunt, Jerusalem's Queen, also by Angela Hunt, A Light on the Hill by Connie Lynn Cassette, A Passionate Hope by Jill Eileen Smith, Isaiah's Daughter by Misu Andrews, Thief of Corinth by Tessa Afshar, and Shelter of the Most High by Connie Lynn Cassette. In 2019, we saw Until the Mountains Fall by Connie Lynn Cassette, The Heart of a King by Jill Eileen Smith, Of Fire and Lions by Misu Andrews, and King's Shadow by Angela Hunt. And in 2020, so far, we've seen Like Flames in the Night by Connie Lynn Cassette, Daughter of Cana by Angela Hunt, The Shepherd's Wife by Angela Hunt, Star of Persia by Jill Eileen Smith, Daughter of Rome by Tessa Afshar, and Isaiah's Legacy by Misu Andrews. 2019 and 2020 also saw the introduction of Guideposts' Ordinary Women of the Bible series, which is a subscription series of monthly biblical fiction novels that you can have delivered right to your door. And that just about brings us up to the present day at the time I'm recording this video. But 2020 also brought us the re-release of Pearl in the Sand by Tessa Afshar. Remember way back when I mentioned it? It was republished this year in a brand new edition to honor the 10th anniversary of the original publication date. Tessa Afshar is certainly considered a mainstay in the biblical fiction genre, whose stories are praised for their depth, intricacy, and historical accuracy. I really love the new edition, and in fact, I reviewed it on my blog, so if you want, you can go check that out right now at www.authorjennavanmaurik.com. Because I know you're dying to see some of this gorgeous beauty on camera, let me quickly compare the two editions side by side with the original edition on the left and the new 10th anniversary edition on the right. Instantly, you'll notice the gorgeous new bright blue cover. What I love is that this cover features so many of the same elements as the old cover, but brings them to life in a fresh, eye-catching way. There's still that bold turquoisey blue color contrasting with that bright scarlet cord, and the intense gaze of the model staring into the distance. Something else that makes this special edition stand out is the beautiful foil design on the cover. To me, this looks like a rose gold or a very light gold foil. I didn't know that the book would have this detail, so it was really a fun surprise to see when it showed up in my mailbox. It's also not something I think you'd notice if you were just looking at the product photos on Amazon or other retailer sites, or on Bookstagram photos, so I've really been looking forward to showcasing it here on my YouTube channel so that you could see it in all of its glory. The inside is equally as detailed. If you flip through, you'll notice that the chapter headers and the scene dividers also have bright red designs to complement the scarlet cord on the cover. Again, I just really love how all of these little details come together to elevate the book and give this story the treatment or quote-unquote interior decorating that it deserves. The old cover was gorgeous, of course, but this one is just as beautiful as the story within its pages. I personally wish we could see all kinds of biblical fiction titles having covers and designs like these. The book also features an updated acknowledgments section, as well as a new note from the author at the beginning of this book. I would like to read some excerpts from that to you right now to truly show you what kind of an impact this book had on the canon of biblical fiction as we know it today. Tessa Afshar writes, "One New Year's Eve, as I was praying about my future, I felt very strongly that I was to write a book that year and to finish it. That night, I made a commitment to the Lord that, regardless of how I felt, I would finish this novel. That year, I wrote Pearl in the Sand. What I didn't know, as I penned Rahab's story, was that few publishing houses at the time were accepting biblical fiction. If I had known that, I would have given up on this story and worked on a different idea. God, in His grace, preserved my heart from the discouragement by keeping me in the dark. Just as Noah built a boat before a single cloud marred the sky, I worked on my own personal arc, a novel based on a biblical story when few in the industry had any interest. Of course, God's timing was impeccable, and by the time the story was finished, the industry was awakening to a burgeoning interest in the genre again. Having written a novel that, at the time, did not really fit the genre, I had no idea what to expect from readers. I was flabbergasted upon hearing the news that 3 days after the release of the book, we had to go into our second printing. I started receiving the most astonishing emails and Facebook posts from readers. The letters have kept coming over the years. Pearl in the Sand has been translated into 8 languages, so I hear from people around the world. Moody Publishers' grace in opening this new door is no less a blessing than the fact that they took a chance on this story in the first place. I can only hope that the fans will enjoy our revised anniversary edition. With that in mind, I knew that the only way to properly showcase this book would be to talk about it with you guys in a YouTube video and feature it in a video essay on the history of biblical fiction. You can purchase this new edition of Pearl in the Sand today, and if you've already read it, don't forget to help show an author some love and let publishers know that we want to see more biblical fiction coming soon by leaving a review on retailer websites. These authors and novels have achieved remarkable success for such a small niche category, which only goes to show just how much readers are interested in well-researched inspirational novels featuring strong female characters and male characters as well. These novels and this genre have changed the religious fiction publishing industry, an industry which is no longer defined by a strictly religious demographic. Inspirational books as a whole are now popular in retailer stores. According to Cook, although it has yet to penetrate the independent bookstore, such inspirational fiction has moved into nationwide discount chains such as Target. Works of biblical fiction also fly off of public library shelves. According to Perez, librarians are also inspiring readers by providing access to many Christian fiction genres. Sustaining the loyalty of Christian fiction readers has become as important as inviting new readers to the diverse genres. The appeal to these novels lies in the mysterious nature surrounding biblical figures, who tend to be regarded by society more as myths and legends than as real historical figures. The novels also hold cross-genre appeal because of the way that they can cast light on a period thousands of years ago, which remains lost to short chapters in dated history books and dusty exhibits in dark museums. The most significant appeal to these novels, however, is that they are shockingly relatable. Perez describes this phenomenon, saying that the spiritual journeys of the characters in the novels through the most challenging of life's trials can provide hope and perspective to their own lives. These stories, although ancient in setting, continue to be relevant in modern times. People, and especially women who are the primary readers of the genre, no matter the century, struggle with adversity, personal challenges, health problems, and so much more. Perhaps the appeal comes from the idea that if someone can endure such hardships in the 1st century, then maybe those facing the same issues in the 21st century can endure as well. Simone Lotvin-Safian argued that the Red Tent's success symbolized detrimental consequences of society's willingness to embrace any new trend, regardless of its more profound significance, so long as it was wrapped up in a matte, mass-market paperback cover and branded with a bestseller stamp. As such, it could not be ignored, at least not by religious scholars, and especially not by those with any kind of religious affiliation. In a sense, Safian was right that the Red Tent might have far-reaching consequences, and these observations about the controversial novel proved to be true. However, perhaps the consequences were not as far-reaching in that they were negative. Perhaps the effects of the Red Tent were a positive thing for both religious and non-religious communities. Safian argued for better representation of biblical figures, and since the Red Tent's release, there has been no shortage of it. For the first time in a long time, people of all denominations were united in the discussion of a single work of fiction. Blasphemous or not, the book also began a movement within publishing industries to produce more religious-based content that appealed to a variety of demographics. Biblical novels have continued to remain on shelves in big chain bookstores and digital search results from online retailers. Recent biblical fiction continues to educate people of all backgrounds on everyday life in biblical times, opening society up to religious themes and undertones in a way that gets readers excited. From a Christian biblical perspective, some of Jesus' most well-known teachings came from parables. Biblical fiction stories serve as modern parables that anyone can hear or read, enabling readers to go on spiritual and emotional journeys with characters that they might discover are not nearly as different as they once believed. According to Lynn S. Neal in Evangelical Love Stories, The Triumphs and Temptations of Romantic Fiction, these novels function as a form of women's ministry, as a way for women to offer spiritual guidance to other women. In a religious subculture where women are often denied positions as pastors, the novels provide a way for women to minister to other women. Authors consistently employ the language of ministry to describe their writing, casting it in utilitarian terms as a vehicle to be used by God. Just as Jesus used stories to teach lessons and attract followers, so too did these women see their stories as divine instruments designed to evangelize and edify. They are called by God to write and share the gospel through romantic fiction. Books like Ben-Hur and The Robe were classics, and Francine Rivers is a prolific writer who has also changed the Christian fiction market in many ways. The Red Tent made many people uncomfortable with its subject matter. However, the book also pushed writers to explore similar themes in their own way, and it forced publishers to fill the literary wilderness where Anita Diamant had first pitched her tent. Books like Love Amid the Ashes by Misu Andrews, Jill Eileen Smith's novels, and Pearl in the Sand by Tessa Afshar tapped into a niche genre, raising the standards for biblical novels and finding a thriving audience along the way. So what does the future of biblical fiction look like? Biblical fiction continues to be a thriving genre with a bibliography that grows longer and longer every year. 2021 will bring us books like Connie Lynn Cassette's Covenant House series, Tessa Afshar's Jewel of the Nile, Jill Eileen Smith's Miriam's Song. The previously mentioned Guidepost subscription series Ordinary Women of the Bible also will be ongoing. Misu Andrews is currently penning a novel on Potiphar's wife. Book 3 in Angela Hunt's Jerusalem Road series, A Woman of Words, will also come out, bringing a splash of New Testament fiction to the lineup. And this doesn't even begin to cover all of the books that will be released by smaller publishers and independent or self-published authors. I will even be releasing my own book, Jerusalem's Daughter, in spring of 2021, and I couldn't be more excited about it. In conclusion, I hope that you enjoyed this video because it's a bit of a different style than I'm used to. A bit more educational and a lot more full of citations and resources and quotations from other writers and academics. But all of my quotes and resources and recommendations and everything will be listed in the description box below for you to easily check out if you would like more information in more detail. Don't forget to also check out this beautiful new edition of Pearl in the Sand. Like I mentioned before, it's available now. I was given a copy by the publisher, but all opinions expressed in this video and in my blog post and in my review are all completely my own. It's a gorgeous edition and an even more beautiful story, so I do highly recommend that you check it out in any form, whether that's ebook or paperback, original or new edition. Once again, my name is Jenna Van Maurik. I'm an inspired writer and an inspirational fiction reader who reads, writes, and lives for Jesus. You can find more about me at these social media links. I'm active on Instagram pretty much every day and here on YouTube and on my blog as often as I can. You'll find my links to social media down below with everything else as well, but I'm at Jenna Van Maurik pretty much everywhere. And if you liked this video, then be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!